Hello, everyone. My name is Sofia Gruskin, and on behalf of the USC Institute on Inequalities and Global Health, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's dialogue, Until We Are All Equal, Protecting Equal Rights. For all who don't know, this is the third in our series marking our Institute's 5-year anniversary. And for us, this is really an impactful marker. It's an inflection point to look backwards, but also with all that's happened recently here in the US and also more generally in the world, it's a chance for us to make clear our firm commitment to addressing health, human rights, and inequalities in all of our work. And I don't only mean now, but in the years to come. So just to kind of give it context, in September, we launched this 5th anniversary series under the banner, Until We Are All Equal. And the first event was Imagining Equal Power, where we had a great group of speakers who discussed strategies to both recognize and actually think about actually disrupting power structures in order to work towards achieving health equity. Then in October, we hosted the second in the series of Advancing Equal Partnerships, where again, an amazing group discussed not only the why, but the how of building equal partnerships in global health research and policy. And, everybody was recognizing the disrupting power imbalances is key, but that moving one step forward in terms of what it takes to actually build and foster partnerships that truly seek to be equal is key. So today's event, Protecting Equal Rights, is intended to continue to shape our collective understanding, focusing on the importance for health of reclaiming rights, even amidst anti-rights and anti-gender movements, and even in this complex geopolitical moment. And as connected to our theme, we're of course going to reflect on current opportunities and constraints, particularly in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, but all with a focus on exploring strategies that can disrupt unequal power dynamics and push forward equal partnerships, and all in service of better protecting rights, health, and well-being. So today's event is going to be moderated by our wonderful IIGH Research Director, Professor Laura Ferguson, someone whose teaching and research truly exemplifies the value of bringing human rights into health work. And she's joined by an incredible group of global health leaders, long-term friends and colleagues, if I'm honest, but also all true visionaries. And I think it's fair to say that each panelist, like all those of us who work at IIGH, understand why rights are key to the work that we all do and why rights have to be upheld, even in very challenging times. And I'm very personally much looking forward to this. And with that, Laura, can I pass it to you to introduce our panelists and take us through this event?
Thank you very much, Sophia. Good morning, good evening. Welcome everyone to this phenomenal panel. Sophia has already underscored the importance and the urgency of this discussion. I think, equal rights has never, at least in my lifetime, felt more important than in this current moment. We have shocking inequalities around the world and also in each of our backyards. And it's the impacts of these inequalities, of the failure to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. The impacts on health, on quality of life, on survival are very real. Now, we know that if we can achieve equal rights, we improve health across many dimensions. And yet there is so much work to be done. So we have a wonderful set of panelists here to help us explore all of this. I'm going to introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll jump straight into a discussion. And just to say, please take as a given for all of the speakers that beyond what I say, they have worked many other places on a huge variety of interesting roles. They have more achievements than I could possibly mention. I'm just going to try and give you a little flavor. So our first panelist, appointed by President Biden, Jessica Stern serves as a United States Special Envoy to advance the human rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons, leading US efforts to protect LGBTQI+ persons globally from violence and discrimination. And prior to joining the Department of State, she led Outright International, a global LGBTQI+ human rights organization, as its executive director for 10 years. Our second panelist, Salima Namusobia, excuse me, Salima, is the Vice President for Africa at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is a global advocacy organization dedicated to advancing reproductive rights. And she's an expert member of the Working Group on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. She's a lawyer with vast experience who has specialized in human rights law and forced migration. Third, we have Sapna Desai, who is a public health specialist based in New Delhi, India, whose work spans grassroots implementation and organizing, evidence generation, and policy action. And she focuses on women's health and sexual and reproductive health and rights over the life course, women's groups and their role in improving health and social protection, and health systems on the path to universal health coverage. And among other ongoing roles, she also co-chairs the board of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. Our fourth panelist, Pascal Allotte, is the director of WHO's Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health, including the Joint Agency Human Reproduction Program. She is a triple certified, which I love, nurse, midwife, and public health nurse with a multidisciplinary background in clinical health sciences, implementation research, anthropology, and epidemiology. She's an incredibly experienced global public health researcher and a leader in gender, equity, health, and human rights. On top of all of this, they're all wonderful human beings, and I am so excited to bring together this panel of exceptional women for this discussion on protecting equal rights. So let's get started. I'm going to ask a few questions, but please feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll get to as many as I can over the course of the hour. So without further ado, I'm going to start with a question for all of you, because you each represent very different kinds of institutions. And with the collective wisdom of this group, I want to say that together in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights, you've seen it all. So an opening question for each of you. For you, what defines equal rights in sexual and reproductive health and rights and in global health more generally? Why do you think that a framing around equal rights is important to the field? And can you share just a little bit about the vision of what equal rights in global health would look like and what you think it'll take to get us there? And can I start with you, Pascal, if that's okay?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's a real gem to have the space to engage in events like this with such a wonderful panel of colleagues and friends. So good day, everyone, and everyone who's joined online as well. Now, I wouldn't say I've seen it all. Every day is an opportunity to learn, reflect, and challenge what I think, what I know. So I'd like to offer a non-academic response because communicating the notion of equal rights in SRHR in particular, sexual and reproductive health and rights in particular, is contentious, is problematic. And so it goes right to the heart of the challenges in the field that we're in today. The only thing that we own that truly belongs to us from birth is our body. That has to be true across religious, cultural, social contexts, and is a powerful, deeply personal statement of autonomy and dignity. Each person, therefore, has the inherent right to make decisions about their own body, free from coercion, judgment, or interference from others. This underscores a fundamental belief that our bodies belong solely to us and that no one else should dictate what happens to them. If we share this belief, then we need to acknowledge and respect individual freedoms and control over the most intimate, meaningful choices. It is about trusting individuals to understand and experience the self in a way that no one else could fully understand or feel. So sexual and reproductive health and rights is a demand for the freedom to live those experiences authentically and fully. It goes beyond a single right. It is the foundation of all rights. Because if we cannot claim ownership over our own bodies, how can we claim ownership over any part of our lives and live with dignity and respect? So in our daily lives, this means the choice of what to do with the body, with whom we want to share our body, free from coercion or violence, whether through the intimacy of sexual relationships or the duration of a pregnancy. And in other words, the primary unit in SRHR is the rights holder who may choose to be a part of a family or not. So in sexual and reproductive health and rights and global health, equal rights are realized when every individual has the opportunity to access comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services, information, diagnosis, treatments, the benefits of science, and make autonomous decisions about their health and be treated with dignity and respect in the health system. It means proactive measures to remove barriers, promote inclusivity, and recognize the intersectional factors that affect access to and quality of care. Sexual and reproductive health and rights services include, but are not limited to, contraception, maternal and perinatal health, safe abortion, prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted infections, prevention of and protection from gender-based violence, and overall gynecological and andrological sexual dysfunction, menopause, and I could go on. It means that everyone should access a full range of sexual and reproductive health and rights services, regardless of geographic, financial, or social barriers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal, for that compelling introduction. Let me pass over to Salima for the same question, please. Salima, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Laura. Good evening, everybody. Equally happy to be here and participate in this panel with all these eminent colleagues. After that definition by Pascal, I think I will be quite short on this question because she's really put out the essentials of what it means from a sexual and reproductive health rights perspective. Just to emphasize that equality in health, especially in relation to sexual and reproductive health rights, would mean equality among individuals, groups, and equality among geographies. And this is also very important for us to look at the geographies perspective, and probably I'll have a chance to speak to that later. For sexual and reproductive health rights, achieving equality would mean, and it would necessitate, autonomy in decision-making for all individuals and equitable access to information and services for all. And when we talk about equitable access, it means that there has to be extra effort that is being done by the various policymakers, by the various duty bearers, to ensure that each individual, regardless of who they are or where they come from, is able to access the SRHR services and information. And I will just give an example. For example, if you look at women, we cannot say that there is equality if essential services required by women are treated, for example, as projects, globally, that are largely funded and implemented by non-state actors outside of the public health system, for example. But we see that this is the situation. If you, for example, do a scan of countries, you will find that in many cases, abortion services, for example, are delivered through non-state actors, and they are not considered to be part of the healthcare system, which is really critical to achieve if we are going to achieve equality in health. But also, we cannot talk about equality when certain groups of people are treated as criminals as they try to access services. And this is again the case for example, women who are seeking abortion care, but they end up in jail simply because they are seeking services that they require, services that are part of healthcare and services that should be recognized as such. So we have to always consider that for us to achieve equality, we need to go the extra mile and ensure that we are providing it for each group, and we are looking at the needs of each group as is. Addressing disparities in health also means addressing unequal power relations and enabling justice and accountability, because this is very important. And also to the last angle that you looked at in terms of why the framing of equal rights is important. It is very important for us to look at health from a human rights perspective, because failure to achieve it, means that there has been a violation that requires justice and accountability. And it also means that individuals and groups are empowered to claim their rights, and they are empowered to enforce their rights in the various jurisdictions they may find themselves. And also the human rights framing will, in most cases, be useful in terms of resource allocation, because once we define SRHR services as human rights, then there is an obligation that is created to the states, to the various duty bearers, to avail the necessary resources that are required to actually ensure that individuals and groups are accessing these services. Thank you, Laura. I'll stop at that on this one.
Thank you very much, Salima. And Sapna, can I pass over to you next, please?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here tonight. So when I think about this, it's really an opportunity to reflect on sort of lessons one has learned from both implementing programs and also conducting research. And the one theme that keeps coming back to me, the importance of this framing in particular, it's about bodily autonomy and equal choices. And the fact that we do live in a world where everyone cannot make decisions about their bodies, and not just in specific countries. I would say this is probably across the globe, where people cannot make decisions about their bodies because they don't have the options or the capabilities to do so, whether they be failures in the health system or the lack of equal rights in terms of being seen as equally eligible for particular services or allowed to access services. So when I think about that globally, and then I apply it to where I sit, I think of it, within the Indian health system, where, there's a continuous expanding of services, but women are still consistently framed as reproducers. And that really defines how services are expanded for women. It's how services are defined for women and what they can access. So to me, an equal framing in SRHR would mean, one, bodily autonomy, equal choices, but secondly, also the equal capability to access services across a life course that women need, and women, men, and all people need, actually. And we see these massive gaps in services. So even those, for example, in India, we've talked about abortion and other settings, even there, even if someone can, in theory, access a service, do they actually have that capability to access the service is the second question. And taking that, I would think, when I think of the vision, Laura, you had mentioned what would a vision look like for this in the future. And I think something we sometimes don't emphasize enough when we think about rights in public health is equal participation and the actual equal voices of people to be heard. There's been a lot of framing in public health and human rights about participation and voice, but what I fail to see, and I think we're very far from that today, is where that voice actually has the space to be articulated. We see various strategies and people organizing to have louder voices, but unfortunately, sometimes the louder voices are just reflective of power. But really creating those spaces for equal participation in the design of public health programs, of service access, and also how we measure what is rights in public health. So to me, a vision would be participatory and bottom up, where we actually heard the voices of people and of women, of men, of all people in the services that they need, and then the services that they can actually access. So I'll end on that to say really the continuing stream, and apologies for being repetitive with the other speakers, is really the idea that I have the equal choice. I can make those choices about my body, both in terms of what my body chooses to do, what I can do, but also what I can access. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Sapna. Thank you so much. And finally, on this first question, Jessica, can I pass over to you for your reflections?
Actually, I just want to listen because the speakers are so interesting. But if I must, Laura, let me just start by saying thank you. It's late in the day here in South Africa, where I'm attending a conference, but this definitely has woken me up because it's so interesting and rich. And I just want to say thank you, Laura. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Jonathan Cohen. Thank you, USC, for this invitation. You know, as I was reflecting on this, I was thinking about how contentious it is to ever define anything. And there's so many good definitions to choose from. I am partial to the definitions that come from civil society, but there are also strong definitions that come from governments that have engaged in meaningful consultations with the people most affected. There are definitions that stem from professional or expert associations. And of course, there are the highly negotiated definitions that come from multilateral institutions, where sometimes we're lucky enough to get definitions that derive from experts, but more often than not, we generate definitions that are the result of carefully and painstakingly negotiated political processes. So rather than focus on a definition, I thought that I would share that I'm currently attending a global meeting of LGBTQI rights advocates and their allies from government, from philanthropy, from academia, and from other sectors around the world. And it's really inspiring and humbling and feels quite urgent to be here. And the kinds of concepts that keep coming up that relate to this question are around access to hormones and other services as part of gender-affirming care, access to contraception, condoms, and lube, access to be free from sexual violence and GBV, access to be free from non-consensual surgeries for intersex persons, access to resources to become parents and to decide when to become parents, including where applicable through alternative insemination, and then to have our children recognized as our own legally, access to PrEP and HIV/AIDS services and care, and access to respectful services and treatment for people impacted by the Mpox crisis. So there are so many examples that keep coming up again and again. I think there are a lot of through lines that we can pick up on, and we've heard from Pascal and others, that the through line is really that people need to be trusted to decide what is best for their bodies. And I would add to that maybe like a contextual, an essential contextual prerequisite is competent and affordable healthcare without discrimination. And so, this question that you've asked, Laura, what is the vision of what it takes to get to equal rights in global health, is the best question, and the question we're very rarely asked. So how do we get there? I think I would just highlight 4 examples. One, sitting in government, I'm very cognizant that we have to be adaptable in the language that we use. And so I think we need to be better at making the argument that equal rights in health are indispensable to every other priority, from the righteous, like human rights, to the mainstream, economic development, national security, strong and healthy democracies, and climate change. What it takes is a real commitment to funding to reach all people, and using health equity as a centerpiece rather than just access to services. The third piece is the kind of legal change that I think a number of speakers have alluded to, including the removal of laws that discriminate and dehumanize, and the passage of laws that really affirm our rights. And then the last piece I will just say is political courage, which unfortunately we don't have enough of in this world, but is something that the students at USC and those of us that are practitioners in the field can really harness. We have achieved so much in the SRHR space, and every time it has been a victory hard won, but we have made progress when we have demanded it.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to all of the panelists for those opening ideas. You know, we have a lot of big ideas, big concepts that are coming through, whether it's bodily autonomy, power, justice, accountability, participation, and I love political courage. And also underlying this, we have the very pragmatic issues around access to services and specific services for different populations across the life course. So I think we've got a really interesting mix of ideas emerging here. So let me come back to you, Pascal, for a minute. I want to take a step back, and we've just been talking about defining and conceptualizing and how many different definitions exist out there, including relating to human rights and health. And I wonder, Pascal, considering the range of positions that you've held from clinical practice to research, advocacy for good policy, your current role at WHO, what do we need? What is needed to truly embed human rights in global health work? And what are the, I guess, obstacles and challenges right now to doing that, as well as any kind of positive examples? Again, let's celebrate the successes of where we have been able to do that. I'll pass to you, Pascal.
Okay, great. So human rights in health face challenges stemming from various, I think, varying interpretations. So whether it's legal implications and assumptions about universality of human rights. And these debates extend obviously beyond health, appearing in discussions on education, migration, and at the Human Rights Council and so on. Political instability, inadequate funding, and competing priorities exacerbate these challenges, often leaving health programs without the support needed to ensure universal access and equity, particularly in low-resource settings. Global health inequities are evident. Wealthier countries and communities tend to have more robust health systems, while low-income regions may lack the infrastructure, trained personnel, and resources needed to provide quality healthcare for all. And this inequality undermines the universality of the right to health, and a lot gets hidden under the notion of progressive realization of rights. And it's further complicated by what I think is an appropriation and sometimes misappropriation of colonial histories and the need to shift the balance of power in global health spaces. Many countries, as we've noted, have restrictive laws or cultural norms that limit women's reproductive rights and prevent them from exercising autonomy over their health choices. And in an age of boundless information, misinformation, and disinformation, there's still a limited awareness of human rights within health systems, which hinders people's ability to demand respectful and equitable treatment. So what can we do about it? The World Health Organization has a number of resources on operationalizing, monitoring, assessing the right to health, which colleagues from USC contributed to. Thank you. Now, these provide countries with guidance on integrating human rights into their health systems and includes practical steps for health assessments, setting indicators, building accountability mechanisms, demonstrating a commitment to global standards for human rights. But from where I sit, a major priority, I think, is for us to listen. It goes back to the previous point about participation, the points about participation, is a major priority is to listen, to learn, and to work together with communities and countries to revamp our ways of working. Doing more of the same, shouting louder, has only got us so far. So maybe we need to pause, we need to reflect, and we need to course correct. So we know, for instance, that human rights-based frameworks integrate principles like equity, accountability, non-discrimination, and participation. And where we need to understand where they have succeeded or failed and who has been left behind. The goal remains accessibility, acceptability, affordability, and so on, especially in marginalized groups. But how can we adapt to context and reach the last mile effectively? We also need to look at inclusive policymaking, which can foster active participation from diverse communities and build trust. Again, a point that's been made, knowing that trust is so easily broken. It's difficult. It's difficult, but not impossible to rebuild. We need to review accountability. I think this is going to keep coming up throughout this conversation. Accountability to communities. But I want to emphasize this because a lot of the ways in which we work tend to be accountability to external funders on particular outcomes, and we forget the people that we're actually working for. We need to look at data for equity. Are we collecting meaningful data that captures the essence of health inequities, rather than just relying solely on proxies, which then have us chasing our tail about indicators while forgetting what it is we're trying to achieve? Legal frameworks have been mentioned already and remain essential for securing public and political support to protect and promote sexual and reproductive health and rights. And ultimately, we need the systems, policies, and practices that prioritize dignity, equity, justice in all aspects of healthcare. So some examples, just to end on a positive note, and I will obviously call out African countries. Rwanda has achieved near universal health coverage by implementing community-based health insurance schemes that focus on equity and inclusivity, even in low-income settings. Sierra Leone is doing some really standout stuff with innovative programs, but that focus primarily on inclusion. South Africa integrated human rights into its national HIV strategy, and by reducing stigma, enacting legal protections, and focusing on access to antiretroviral therapy for all, South Africa has significantly reduced, I'm not saying perfect, but South Africa has significantly reduced HIV-related mortality. And so programs also focus on empowerment and education, especially for marginalized populations, underscoring the role of community-centered health interventions. And I'll finish by saying that feminist foreign policies are a personal favorite of mine. And I'm shouting out to countries like Sweden, Canada, France, Germany, which have pushed a strong emphasis on health rights, particularly for women and girls. They prioritize gender equality and fighting discrimination in global health work. And love it or hate it, the approach has paved the way for more inclusive health interventions and raised global awareness of the role of gender equity in health. And I'll end there.
Fantastic, Pascal. Thank you. I mean, there's some really serious challenges that you have highlighted there. But what I love is the range of examples that you could just provide of these very, very different approaches that have been successful in really trying to promote equal rights. So let me just open up briefly to see if any of the other panelists would like to add on this, particularly around any key actions that you think are important in the current moment in terms of overcoming current obstacles. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I would want to jump in, Laura, and for me to just emphasize the issue of the power asymmetries that exist between the more privileged countries and other countries that are lower income and marginalized groups, and to emphasize the need that we must ensure that in global decision-making that impacts health and human rights, everyone has the same voice and power, and that the decisions made do not undermine human rights standards and the standards that have been put in place, for example, by institutions like WHO. And for me, I would want to use the example of misuse of power that has ended in impacting against sexual and reproductive health rights. For example, looking at the United States as a leading global health funder, and what happened with the global gag rule, for example. During the Trump administration, previously, the fact that the funding for SRHR went down significantly, research has shown that countries were significantly impacted. For example, Uganda, Ethiopia, the SRHR outcomes went significantly low. But this is an example of a country having power and knowing that whatever it does, impacts other countries. So there has to be initiatives that check this power and hold these countries to account when they misuse this power. Thank you.
Thank you, Salima. And if I can, let me stay with you and build on that a little bit. Because you mentioned this idea of a government in the global north with substantial power affecting sexual and reproductive health outcomes of people in other countries in the global south. And you have a very long history of effective advocacy, building partnerships in the most complicated spaces while addressing these implications of unequal power. And I think sort of everyone on this panel works at the intersection of health and rights, but you very much come into the conversation from the law side. So from the legal perspective, I'm interested, do you think there is still a solid human rights framework to work with, and the issue is simply about implementation, or moving forward, are there institutional or structural changes that are needed for rights in health to be fully protected at the international level?
Thank you, Laura. And from my perspective, the human rights framework we have is sufficient to ensure that individuals, groups, regardless of where they are or who they are, do actually access their rights. I am a strong advocate of reforms and making amendments here and there. But given the current environment we find ourselves in, with the anti-rights groups being very aggressive, about ensuring that we retrogress in terms of the human rights standards we have, I would, right now, I wouldn't encourage, opening up the framework to say, let us go back and negotiate. For example, in Africa, if we opened it up now, I don't think we would get a document as strong as Maputo Protocol, which we have, that has set standards on the continent and is being utilized to enforce rights on the continent. That said, I think there are a number of improvements that can be made, a number of structural and institutional changes that need to be made. For example, there is need to restore the integrity and power of human rights mechanisms at all levels, national, regional, and global. We see that these human rights mechanisms are significantly impacted now in terms of, for example, financing, in terms of the capacity of the people who are serving in these human rights mechanisms. You find that some of them are actually getting onto these committees and treaty bodies for the wrong reasons, to actually ensure retrogression. And we need to be able to ensure that we are protecting the integrity of these mechanisms, because they are the ones that help us implement the various human rights mechanisms. Also, we need to recenter the human being in the rights framework and ensure that we are focusing on the needs of the rights holders. We are focusing on the participation of the rights holders, and we are focusing on ensuring that we are promoting rights and not actually taking away from that. We should not be making policy decisions based on ideology or based on, things that are up in the air, or how people feel, or because, you know, people believe that something is immoral, and that is the basis of the policy making that is happening. We should be focusing on data. We should be focusing on science. If if data is telling you that, for example, abortion is a major cause of maternal mortality, it is not right that people sit and start developing policies that are counter to that simply because whatever they believe in tells them that, you know, abortion should not be a human right. So these are the things that we need to start paying attention to within the human rights framework, because the documents do exist and the rights have been set out. But also, as was discussed earlier, these rights by birth. You know, it is not that people are giving them. So we should be able to focus on the data and statistics, but also reopen the civic space in the human rights mechanisms, because right now it is shrinking. You find a situation where a mechanism is discussing, for example, adolescent sexual and reproductive health rights, and you do not even have youth. They are fighting to get access to be able to speak, and yet these mechanisms are giving platforms to people who are speaking against the rights of these youths and individuals. So we need to get back there and get back to the spirit of the instruments that we have, and make sure that the human rights framework and the mechanisms that we have are actually supporting human rights and not taking away. I realize there is a time factor, so I'll just highlight the other things that we need to do. For example, making the linkages between rights and the determinants of health. For example, we need to care about what happens in the space of intellectual property, for example, in the space of dates, and make these linkages, not to say, you know, one issue belongs in a different sector, and then there is the human rights sector on the one hand, but also we need to check private power. Laura, if we have more time, I could get into the details of some of that, but right now I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic, Salima. And of course, I hope we have more time to unpack all of that. Look, you've raised some really important issues here. The current environment and the fears that exist around negotiating anything at the moment in a multilateral space, I think, are very real. And so I think this sort of pragmatism of saying, look, the human rights framework exists as it is. Let us focus on implementation rather than open up a can of worms that could take us backwards, I think is a really important thing to recognize about the current moment. But I think that same geopolitical space determines to a large extent the financing and the capacity that you were talking about for the human rights system. So a challenge remains there. And I think another challenge that you alluded to is in this need to focus on data and science, we need, first of all, trust in data and science. And second of all, we need communication around these things, a point that Pascal mentioned at the very beginning. And we need participation of the right voices in these processes. So some really important things that we need to strengthen that really come back to implementation and accountability of existing frameworks. And I wondered if any of the other panelists had quick points about that you wanted to add in terms of how to make best use of the human rights system in this moment. All right, I'm going to, oh, Pascal, did you?
No, I was just going to say I'm acutely aware of time as well, and I really want to hear from Sapna and
Okay, fantastic. So Sapna, let me turn to you then. And let's get concrete and focus on implementation, grassroots organizing, and the kinds of research that truly make a difference in people's lives. And what do you think it takes for human rights to be embedded in public health research at this level, and not simply as an afterthought or carried out by a few wonderful, dedicated people? And it feels a little bit like a few years ago, there was a bit more traction around this. But more recently, perhaps for some of the reasons that we've talked about, this feels less present than it used to. And I wondered if you could share some of the key lessons and takeaways from your own experience about how might we regarner attention to rights in public health? What are the immediate priorities for that? And also, what are the longer term things that we need to be thinking about for future global health leaders being prepared for?
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to start with action and then move into the evidence and the research part intentionally. Look, I agree that I think the current system as it stands needs a major rehaul, to be very honest. And I don't mean just the global structures, I mean even within countries, but the relationship between action and evidence, or evidence and action and advocacy is, it's difficult, it's tenuous, but interestingly still, the power is wielded by a select few. So if I were to take a step back in terms of, and I'd like to talk about what I've seen that's worked. If I think about organizing, now I've seen organizing in all forms, from local women's groups to large trade unions, but also really organizing for participation. And organizing for a principle is different than organizing for a specific issue. And I'll give an example. There's a huge distance between people and public health programs quite often. And we have methods, and there have been strategies, and one very simple and very straightforward one is just using participatory approaches within public health programming, like participatory learning and action. Basic taking women, groups of women and communities, so not just women, but and their communities, through cycles of women themselves identifying their problems and solutions, requires trusting what people know about their own bodies. The kind of resistance I've seen, despite very rigorous evidence on the impacts on things like neonatal mortality, for example, in India, we still have seen resistance, particularly from global funders, interestingly, in wanting to invest more in ideas that are bottom up. And I think we have to ask why. Why is it that despite the research and despite the basic principle that people know best what to do in their circumstances and will come up with solutions, has still not really seen sort of mainstream public health practice? So though it's a positive example of something we've known that's worked, what always puzzles me is why there's so much resistance. Well, it's not puzzling, I think we know why, but why there's so much resistance to actually allowing for that space in the actual design of interventions themselves and service delivery, as well as accountability. So that's one. And then the second, in terms of action, and I think where we have a lot to remember, and sort of the history of human rights, perhaps, and the movements have been so much based on coalition building. And we think of coalition building right now in the negative, but there's also a great positive, and we've seen those positives. And very, very recently, Sexual Reproductive Health Matters, we organized a meeting to think about strategies, and learning from Colombia, for example, and learning from the movements in Colombia towards abortion, for example, and rights to safe abortion, the strategies that were used in terms of community organizing, media. I think something people walked away from, we had representatives from around the world, was that, maybe the media hasn't been used well enough, and movements haven't really understood how to communicate some of our, not our evidence, the evidence, the scientific evidence around issues that people are facing in terms of access to sexual and reproductive health services. So again, the coalition building in the positive to share strategies is something that needs to be strengthened again and regarnered, because I think we are busy thinking about the negative rather than thinking about, well, who has been able to achieve change as, recently as last year in many countries in terms of improving access to rights. And that brings me to evidence. And again, going back to my idea of the massive restructure, when I think about rights and research and evidence, I ask myself these questions all the time. And is really, who decided the question? It's the process. Who decides the question? How that research is conducted, but most importantly, is it useful and how is it being used? I mean, we often see things stop way before even question definition. These things are hard. These processes actually to do in practice, because I do them and I try to do them, I should say, it's difficult. It requires deep partnerships. It requires a lot more time. But really, if research is being conducted and evidence is being generated, synthesized, or used to actually make a difference in ensuring the most vulnerable have access to the services that they rightfully deserve, requires these kinds of partnerships around evidence. I see evidence globally just stop at the paper. It stops at the design done by someone else without the actual participation of the people most affected, it is very easy to write in 3 lines. It is very difficult to do in practice. And I think that that massive restructure has to begin here. It has to begin with the idea of participation in our processes. And I think that is really where a lot of the problems lie, in terms of, bridging that distance between who decides what gets studied, who decides what evidence is generated, but really how it's used. And I think even with the existing evidence we have, I'm not even advocating for new evidence generation, but to think about the issues we're facing in different settings, to really learn how to use evidence better with the people who affects it the most. And I mean, I really hope these words don't ring empty, because in practice, it is so difficult to do and see. And I'd love to see a lot more for it in terms of spaces for true participation in the generation and use of evidence. So I think I've just said quite a bit, so I'll stop there.
Sapna, thank you. And let me reassure you, those words don't ring empty. I think it's incredibly important. And like you say, I think it's very difficult. It's time consuming because you have to build trust, and it doesn't fit the current funding paradigm of many of the people supporting global health research. And so coming back to systemic change that's required, I think that's a really important piece of it. I'm also reminded by my panelists of the passage of time. So I'd like to move into a discussion of the ways in which political priorities and geopolitics can impact how we think about and address equal rights. And Jessica, I'd like to start with you on this one if I can, and ask if you might talk a little bit about the impacts of geopolitics on global health and human rights priorities, and in particular, what this means for the specific populations that you work with. Oh, you're muted.
I'm happy to, Laura. Thanks for the question. And I would just add that the other piece that I've become obsessed with lately is not only good data collection and ethical data collection, but then getting good data into the right hands. I'm astounded by how much useful data is underutilized. And I think coming from civil society and entering government, I've really had access to some of the best minds in civil society, which has made me a better government official. But I think about my colleagues who don't know where the NGO reports are or how to find them. And I feel like government officials are often making life-changing decisions about public policy without being fully informed by the best data. So my wish to put into the universe is that we have more focus on the distribution strategy for good data. But to your question, I think I'll focus by just giving a brief explanation of the relationship between LGBTQI rights and elections. And I want to start by making the point that we frequently see that LGBTQI issues are weaponized in elections. LGBTQI issues will suddenly become almost a mainstream topic of conversation. And that's because LGBTQI issues, and often the dehumanization of LGBTQI people, are used to drive voters to the election polls. And it generates a kind of disproportionate visibility to LGBTQI issues that is rarely paired with a commensurate political support for the actual sexual and reproductive health and rights needs of LGBTQI people. And so the consequences around elections, we see increased hate speech, increased discrimination, and increased violence against LGBTQI plus people. A second point that I would make is that I've observed that political progress on sexual and reproductive health and rights and LGBTQI rights often decrease as elections near because of the fear that there will be voter backlash for support for LGBTQI rights and SRHR. And I wish I could say that this is just speculation, but it's something that once I joined government, I started hearing from counterparts in governments almost as something that was just accepted as fact. The third point I would emphasize is that people are policy. And when women and LGBTQI people are underrepresented in government, it has a catastrophic impact on the credibility of elections. If we're not electing people that represent all of us, then we don't have holistic expertise in government making decisions that impact all of our public policies and lives. And the last thing I would emphasize that's become really clear over the past few years is that we see lesser known members of parliament and Congress building national, regional, and even global reputations based on anti-SRHR and anti-LGBTQI positions. And I think it's quite complicated because we're increasingly seeing members of parliament being caught between the desires of the citizenry and these global geopolitics that you're referring to, Laura. So I would just say that in the context of elections generally, I think that we're really in an anti-global moment, and we're seeing a rise of a focus on national sovereignty. And so I think to advance SRHR, we have to have serious conversations within elections about why global human rights matters and why foreign assistance matters. We're seeing attacks on foreign assistance in some of the most historically generous donor countries. And we have to ask ourselves why. And we have to be very clear that we will all suffer if foreign assistance drops, because human rights and public health will be eroded. So just to end on a positive note, I would emphasize a few solutions that I see in this space, because if we don't end with solutions, then we don't see the way forward. One recommendation I have is we need to take more seriously active engagement with parliamentarians, which often feel like they're off limits to us, but parliaments are often a source of harm for our communities. And so we really have to build those relationships even where it's hard. The second piece is we have to explain why foreign assistance matters. The third piece is I think we have to really activate our communities as voting blocks. We have political power. We have to do better at exercising our political power. And then the fourth point that I would emphasize is that I think we have to stop using jargon. We love to talk about human rights. We love to talk about strong and healthy democracies. We love to talk about SRHR. And people are asking, what do these concepts really mean? And how do they connect with my daily lives? If we can figure that out, I think we'll be in good shape.
Great. Thank you, Jessica, for bringing us back to where we started with Pascal right at the beginning about communication and making sure that we are being clear in what we're talking about in ways that resonate with people's lives, so that people recognize what is on the line when we're really talking about equal rights. We're running really short of time. To wrap things up, I'd really like to ask you if just in 30 seconds, each of you, what is one action or idea that you would want the next generation of health and human rights leaders to take away from this event, and really to move from a conceptual theoretical discussion about advancing rights in global health to actually making a difference? So what is one action that you would want to propose? And Jessica, let's start with you this time.
I told a colleague that I was speaking with a group of mostly students from USC, and she said, well, students are the answer, so be sure you don't give them too much hope. Make them angry, and they'll fight for their rights and all of our rights. So I hope you guys got some hope from this, but you also need to be at least a little bit angry. There's a quote, and I think it's from Coretta Scott King, which is that every generation has to fight for and secure its rights. And so I would just say this is the moment where we're counting on you to help us fight for and secure our own. Please don't be daunted by setbacks. The work for equality is something that is never ending.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Salima, quick action thoughts.
Thank you. I would say that utilizing a human rights approach is critical to achieving health and human rights generally, and it will be very useful in terms of tackling global inequality. But also to say that it will sometimes be tough, especially now at this point where we are. But we have to remain steadfast and ensure that we are pushing forward in terms of defending and protecting human rights, specifically sexual and reproductive health rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Pascal.
I would say we need to recognize that while we've made progress, it's not linear, and the contexts are complex, the issues are difficult, and so on. But we need to have hope, and we need to have courage. And courage is important because it leads to action. Change is slow in hostile contexts, but history shows that persistence, coalition building, and strategic advocacy can make a breakthrough, even in the face of autocracy and misogyny. So hope and courage. They will endure.
Thank you, Pascal. And Sapna, please.
Well, we're all here because we care, but we're all here because we've seen change in our lives already, positive change and progress. So the only thing I would say to students is to really ask yourselves and make yourselves go the distance. Did you go the distance to ensure that those who matter were part of every part of your journey as well?
Wow. Thank you all so much. I can't believe we've run out of time already. I have so many more questions. This has been such a rich discussion, and thank you all for sharing your wisdom, for inspiring us to see the ways in which we can, and indeed in which we must work to protect rights and ultimately the difference that it can make. To the audience, thank you all for being here. We have another stellar webinar coming up next month. To be honest, I'm not sure how we'll top this one, but we will try. You can see the details here. It will be on the impacts of the recent US election on power, partnerships, and rights in global health. So I hope you all can join us then. Until then, be well, and thank you very much for being here.